There are two gambles which have been lost here. The immediate gamble which was lost was Vladimir Putin's gamble, because when he could not break the Zelensky government very quickly, when he could not overrun Kyiv, when his forces had to withdraw from northern Ukraine in April, he in effect had already lost his bet that he could conquer that country. And it is just a matter of time that you see the Russians get pushed back and back and back, with all the consequences that are going to happen, not just in terms of Russian forces in Ukraine, but within Russia. First of all, it's not just the US. UK Defense Intelligence, in their daily report today, used almost the exact same wording of a strategic partnership, cooperation between Russia and Iran. And let's start off with some basic facts that during the summer, when Russia was running short of drones, both surveillance and attack drones, Iran began supplying them. They supplied Shahed 136 attack drones and Mohajer 6 surveillance drones. The Ukrainian officials say up to 2,500 in total. We know that hundreds of those drones were used in attacks alongside missiles that started in September, that escalated from October, trying to knock out Ukraine's energy infrastructure and hitting civilian sites. Now, the Iranians deny this. The foreign minister says, oh, well, we gave them a few drones, but it was some time ago. But any military analyst who's watching, and indeed Ukrainians, will know that the Iranians are an essential part of the Russian attacks. And indeed, Russia ran out of those drones in November, and there was a question as to whether the Iranians will resupply them. And their indications are that after meetings in Tehran with high-level Russian officials, they are resupplying. Now, here's the question of what comes next. What the Americans are saying, first of all, which is significant from the Iranian side, is that the Iranians are being trained on Russian jet fighters, Su-25 jet fighters. And the question is, will Russia begin to supply those jet fighters to the Iranians, which would change the military balance in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf? And going the other way, the Russians really need more ballistic missiles. They have used up most of their stock with these waves of attacks to try to knock out Ukraine's electricity, its water, its utilities, and they may be turning to Iran to provide hundreds of ballistic missiles. Iranian officials, not American officials, not UK officials, Iranian officials themselves said that those discussions were being had. The question is whether they progress to the point of agreement and then delivery of those missiles, which again would be significant, of course, for the Ukrainian theater, but also would be significant in terms of a Russian-Iranian military alliance.
And if all this is the case, Scott, how likely is it that the US acts against Iran and Russia? And if they do, what will those actions be?
Well, the US is already acting, and again, not just the US. Remember, there's more countries here. If you paid careful attention this week, you'll notice that in a coordinated effort, the US, Britain, Canada, and the European Union all announced further sanctions on Iran. Now, some of those sanctions are over Iran's violations of the regime's violations of human rights with the mass killing of protesters since those protests developed in mid-September. But it's also the case that those sanctions are escalating on Iran, and of course already there on Moscow, over the weapons being used in Ukraine. So that economic lever is being used, and that's quite significant. Secondly, is what the Americans have said in the last, really, since Monday, when Ukraine for the first time struck Russian air bases deep inside the country. And for the first time, the Americans effectively said, hey, Ukraine's a sovereign country. If they want to defend themselves this way, so be it. Now, that, of course, is something that directly affects Russia, but it's also a signal to Iran, not that there's going to be a military attack anytime soon, but it's really asking the Iranians, how much do you want to tie yourself to a country which is really on the losing side of this bet, politically, economically, and now militarily?
I mean, that's a really interesting question, isn't it, Scott?
Well, I think it is. And Tala's the expert here. He's going to be able to come in and give the wisdom.
Yes.
But I think what you're looking at is, and I wrote about this a few weeks ago, just, trying to put two and two and make it four. the Russians have very few friends uh, in the world right now. They are relying on two countries for military supplies, North Korea and Iran. Not exactly the heaviest of heavyweights. They're economically isolated from much of the world. They just had a major setback within the past 24 hours, where China and Saudi Arabia issued a pointed statement directed at Iran, but also at the Russians, which said, we're not going to back you here all the way. Iran itself is in economic crisis, currency at an all-time low, has mass protests, the largest protest possibly since 2009, over political, social rights, women's rights, and justice. These are two countries being drawn together not because of strength, but because of weakness. The question is, have they tied an albatross around each other's necks with their declaration of cooperation?
Scott, I'm going to go back to you saying that there's been more sanctions implemented and that they're escalating. And it's interesting, the time that I've certainly spoken to Russians about this attitude of more sanctions and more sanctions. How effective is sanctioning to these countries?
Yeah, first of all, I think we've got a problem with sanctions, and it's part of the rapid pace of the news cycle, and it's part of human expectation, which is, are they going to work today? Are they going to work next week? Are they going to work in a few weeks' time? I think when these sanctions first began to be imposed after Vladimir Putin's invasion of February 24th, policymakers knew they were not going to break the Russian economy immediately. They knew it wouldn't break Russian support for the war immediately because many people will be loyal to their leadership. And if they're not loyal, they'll be coerced or they'll be imprisoned or worse in Russia. The idea of sanctions was to slowly constrain Russia. It was to slowly constrain its economic ability, to constrain its manufacturing, to constrain its trade. And now at the point now where we're talking about constraining its oil revenues. So it's sort of been a step-by-step process. I think the sanctions could have been quicker. I think they could have been quicker on the oil and gas industry, for example. But I do think they have slowly constrained the Russians as a supporting mechanism, which was behind the major thing in this conflict. And that is, would Ukraine prevent being overrun in the first few weeks of this invasion? And not only has Ukraine prevented being overrun, they've turned the battlefield in their favor. And that's where sanctions come in now as a complementary factor, which is Russia will not be able to rebuild the strength to put itself back into a winning position.
Abdul, I'm going to bring you in now from an Iranian perspective. Is it in Iran's interest to be supporting Russian aggression against Ukraine?
Just to begin with, my name is Talha.
Oh, I
Abdul's
do
kind of...
apologize, Tala. I do apologize. I will
That's
kill
all right, no
someone. No,
problem.
I won't kill anyone. No, not while we're talking about this. No, so please, yeah,
Maybe off air.
yes, Talal. Please do tell me what you think about the Iranian perspective on this.
Sure.
Is it in Iran's interest to be supporting Russian aggression against Ukraine or not?
I mean, absolutely not, in my view. Let's just put morality to one side for now. And obviously, it's a hugely immoral thing to do for Russia to go and invade Ukraine, quite aside from its own security concerns regarding NATO expansion and so on. But if you're looking at the Iranians in particular, you have to understand they have like a home crowd, although it's not strictly a democracy in the sense that you're going to have recurring elections, legitimate, real elections, where you're going to get fundamental change in government. You still have a supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and you still have the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is the guardians of the state, as it were. And they pander to a very specific audience. They have a very specific narrative. They're always about the axis of resistance. We're resisting the West. We're resisting the US, the Great Satan. All of these kind of rhetorical mechanisms that they use to maintain support amongst the masses. Now, as we've seen, those masses aren't unified on that message. Quite apart from the issue of women's rights and the protests that have been ongoing since September. Not all Iranians want to be in this kind of situation whereby their government is leading them from one disaster to another, from one crisis to another, decades of sanctions. We're looking, I think, at the Iranian rial is something like 300,000 reals to the dollar. That's an insane figure.
That is an
It just
insane
shows that,
figure.
yeah, exactly. I mean, it
Wow.
just shows how poor their economy is. And, like him or loathe him, and he is an odious man, but President Donald Trump, his maximum pressure campaign was getting results prior to obviously the Biden administration coming in. And even then, as the Biden administration intimated that they wanted to get back to the JCPOA, colloquially known as the Iran nuclear deal, Iran felt the need to show that they were sticking it to the Great Satan, that they were going to be in this fight in the long term, and that they weren't going to kowtow to anyone. Now, naturally, and as things are unfolding before us now, that appears to be a wholly unwise move, because President Biden was very much willing to, sign America back onto the JCPOA. He just wanted assurances from the Iranians as well. Now, you can make an argument as well that, okay, then how can they trust the Americans? Because previously President Trump had withdrawn the United States from the JCPOA, and there's a trust issue there. But lots of people understand the dynamics of American politics. Lots of people understand that Trump was actually very much an outlier when it comes to U.S. politics. He, even by Republican standards, there's not really been a Republican president like him ever, not in recent memory anyway. Even if we're going to someone like George Bush, who's very much seen as a warmongering president, who initiated the wars in Afghanistan and the absolute blunder that was Iraq. Even someone like him is nothing like Trump. So it would have been a safe bet if you were sat in the halls of power in Tehran to look at President Biden and think, you know what, this is a guy that is actually interested in getting back on board. And in fact, it was his boss, former President Obama, who was the architect of this whole thing. So it would have definitely been in their interest to sign back up to it. Instead, what they decided to do was to engage in a game of brinkmanship, except the issue that they face is not only is their economy in tatters, conventionally, they cannot face the United States or its Western allies in conventional military terms. They cannot face them in economic terms. They cannot face them in political terms. Their only real ally is Russia. And even then, it's kind of like a marriage of convenience. So you look at, for example, how they divvy up power in Syria. The Iranians aren't too happy with the way the Russians just came in 2015 and took over a lot of places that they thought were earmarked for their influence and their spheres of control. So that's something that's going to be kind of, sticking in their craw a bit. But at the same time, they look at Russia and think, you know what, we can take advantage of these weapons. We can have a more advanced air defense system. We can get our hands on Sukhoi 35 fighter jets. And obviously that, as Scott was saying, will definitely impact the balance of power in the region. If that happens, we're going to see a Middle Eastern arms race. And that's an outcome no one wants to see.
It's interesting that you say a marriage of convenience, and certainly we can see that outside of that, looking inwards. But it's about the strength of that relationship, isn't it? Because I remember being in Astana during the first peace talks to do with Syria, and there the countries were, Russia, Iran, Turkey. How strong is that relationship, Dalha?
I think as long as there are, as long as they have a common enemy that can bring them together, they'll always work together. And also, they have many mutual interests. They both have an interest in propping up the Assad regime, for example. They both have an interest now in coming closer together to face off against what they see as U.S. hegemony in the region. And obviously, there's no doubt the U.S. is still the global hegemon. It's, it's receded quite a bit. It's more isolationist than it used to be. The world is slowly becoming more multipolar again, unlike the unipolar world post-Cold War. But the Iranians, at the same time, they see themselves as benefiting a lot from this relationship because the Russians also provide them with some kind of a veto in the UN Security Council. But that, again, is a foolhardy way of looking at things, because if we're looking at the JCPOA and the UN Security Council resolutions that were passed, again, they cannot be passed unless there's if the Russians vetoed it, that would have been the end of it. But the Russians didn't veto it. They actually signed up to it. And so now that you've got the Iranians supplying them with drones and, perhaps supplying them with ballistic missiles down the road, the Russians themselves are in breach of the resolution that they themselves voted for. So it's a very complicated, like, when people look at international politics, they often kind of skip over these things. But when you actually look at the detail and you see how these countries interact with one another and how their relationships intertwine, and sometimes they work, with each other and sometimes against each other. That's why a lot of politics, especially in the Middle East, requires heavy compartmentalization. Because if you don't have that, what happens is that you're going to butt heads on every single thing that comes your way, every kind of issue that you can't overcome because you always say, well, hang on, they for want of a better term, they shafted us on this, so now we have to retaliate. It becomes zero sum. But they're not doing that with the Russians because they realize we're stuck in this corner. We're being hammered economically. We may as well, as the Americans say, do a Hail Mary on this and try to get in and maintain some kind of strong alliance with a great power that has a veto power within the UN Security Council. Well, I think it's similar actually when you get various nations hacking each other. So whenever you get kind of like cyber attacks against other nations, there's always this level of deniability because sovereign states ordinarily, unless they're engaged in direct conflict and war, prefer to have a level of deniability so that they can always pivot from their positions. Because, as I was saying earlier, interests often collide and sometimes converge. So you don't want to always be, on a kind of a binary level when you're dealing with states. It can't always be a 0 or a 1. There has to be a lot of variation in between. So if you maintain that deniability, and in Iran's case, they are undergoing an intense period of negotiations. And, you have to bear in mind that at the time the war was kicking off, there were ongoing talks in Vienna to discuss Iran's nuclear program and bringing the U.S. administration back into the JCPOA. So it's kind of like playing both sides of the fence. On one hand, they want to kind of support the Russians, who had been, supplying them with weapons and who had been vetoing various resolutions in their favor. And on the other, they wanted to see if they could make any headway and get a lot of concessions out of the US and the EU. They were hoping that with the energy crisis and everything else going on, and with Europe's need to diversify its energy supplies, that maybe, just maybe, they might be able to slip through the cracks and get a lot of concessions just for the sake of signing on to the JCPOA again and opening up Iran's energy markets to the world. That didn't materialize in the way that they thought it might. There were a lot of delays. There was a lot of kind of hemming and hawing over specifics within the deal. There was, like, as I said earlier, a lack of trust between the parties. And so Iran thought to up the ante and up the pressure. And they did that through a variety of means, and not just the war in Ukraine. There's a whole other Middle Eastern dynamic in terms of how Iran weaponizes its Shia militia proxies in Iraq, in Syria, and how it threatens Saudi Arabia, for example, or the United Arab Emirates and various other large energy suppliers on the international market. So that's why Iran was kind of playing this double game and being a bit duplicitous. But again, it's not unique to Iran. This kind of behavior is common amongst basically every state, where they'll state one position and go act and do something else.
Yeah, and they did admit to it eventually, to supplying some drones, but it didn't make them look good, did it?
No, it didn't. And not only that, again, going back to the JCPOA and going back to the UN Security Council resolution that endorsed it, it shows that they were in breach immediately. When they're admitting to supplying Russia with drones, it doesn't matter how many they supplied. The whole point is that they shouldn't. And Russia, again, was one of the parties to this. It was one of the nations that passed it in the UN Security Council. So with Iran supplying these drones, even though they think, oh, well, it predated the war. They may even say, oh, it was just a technical exercise. It wasn't actually military supplies or something like that. And they're trying to find now various loopholes within the annexes of the agreement. But the fact remains that they supplied military technology to the Russians. The Russians even have their own designation for the Shahed 136 drone. It's called the Geran 2. So they have their own military designation for this. So, what does that tell you? It tells you that the Russians are taking advantage of this technology, and it's cheap, it's quite effective, and it's a loitering munition that kind of functions as a swarm. It tries to overwhelm air defense systems and so on. And as Professor Lucas was saying earlier, the Russians have expended a lot of ammunition, a lot of artillery, a lot of missiles, a lot of lives in this war. They thought that they were just going to steamroll all the way to Kiev. That never happened. And so they ended up not being in a position whereby they have geared their industry to support a war for the long term. Like at the moment right now, you can see them scrambling. They're trying to mobilize more men. They're conscripting people. They're trying to ramp up their production. And that's why there's these discussions now between Iran and Russia about perhaps opening up a manufacturing plant within Russia for these Shahed 136s or Geran 2s.
Scott, if we widen the discussion, given this potential for them to work together, creating lethal weapons, where does the US stand now on the war in Ukraine?
Again, it's not just the US, it's the international community.
Mm-hmm.
I think what you have to emphasize here is that reducing this to a US versus Iran conflict is what the Iranian regime wants to do. The US is the great Satan. They're the ones that are manipulating the others. They've got, their Zionist Israeli ally. The UK is a puppet alongside them. The fact is that there are two gambles which have been lost here. The immediate gamble which was lost was Vladimir Putin's gamble, because when he could not break the Zelensky government very quickly, when he could not overrun Kyiv, when his forces had to withdraw from northern Ukraine in April, he in effect had already lost his bet that he could conquer that country. And it is just a matter of time that you see the Russians get pushed back and back and back, with all the consequences that are going to happen, not just in terms of Russian forces in Ukraine, but within Russia itself. But the second gamble, which is the one we're really talking about tonight, is the Iranian regime's gamble. Because Professor Abdulrazaq's absolutely right. You were in a position at the start of this year where Iran could have had a nuclear deal with the US rejoining it. Iran would have had sanctions lifted upon it. It would have had much more political, economic space. There were elements within Iran that wanted to do that, especially the foreign ministry. But the supreme leader and the Revolutionary Guards decided, no, we're going to take our bet on this so-called axis of resistance. We somehow are going to mobilize the rest of the world in support of our position alongside our allies, like the Assad regime in Syria, like Hezbollah in Lebanon, but alongside Russia as well. And that gamble has failed really badly. And to give a bit of historical context, which is important, when they took that gamble, they cast aside another foreign policy approach that had been taken in the 1990s, when Iran was trying to recover from the Iran-Iraq war. And that is neither east nor west. That you don't put all your chips on one side of what is happening here, or to put it another way, both east and west. You trade east towards China, towards Russia, but you trade with the west as well. They had the opportunity to get back into a balanced position this year, but because you got a supreme leader in his 80s who is devoted to the idea that the US and its allies are these satanic powers trying to overthrow him, and there are people who do want to overthrow him, but he's devoted to the idea that there's no way that Iran can have any type of accommodation. And so he gambles. And as I said, it's not going to happen next week. It's not going to happen in the next few months, but it's a losing bet. And the repercussions are not just going to be on Iran standing in the international community. They will be inside a country where many people have chanted since 2009 and again, neither Gaza, nor Lebanon, nor Syria, in this case, nor Russia, focus on what we need at home. And what they do not need is this very shaky alliance with the Russians.